I am so honored to be here. I think this is my first attempt of being an MC, so I was actually a little nervous tonight doing this. So honored. As soon as I realized that Dr. Olasky was going to be here, I wanted to meet this man for at least 20 plus years. I went to Grace Centers of Hope 26 years ago. It basically was the Pontiac Rescue Mission, and mainly was a flop house. It was all men at that time. Same guys in, same guys out, feed them, clothe them, shelter them. I became chairman of the board and became very frustrated. Actually, the local police department arrested 27 guys out of our big dorm. They had a car theft ring going. So at Pontiac Rescue Mission, we were feeding, clothing, and sheltering them, and they were stealing your cars. Part of the entitlement program that goes on here in our country. So we lost our CEO, and so they asked me to fill in. After all, I was a pastor and only working 1 day or 2 days a week. And so I became the CEO, and they didn't look for anybody, and I didn't look back, and I resigned from the board and became CEO. I had known for maybe a year or two, having served on the board, that if all you're doing is keeping the drug addict alive, that's horrible charity. You can't call that charity. There must be a work of God in the heart, a transformation, becoming of a new creature, what we call regeneration, and only God can do that, and He does it through the gospel of His Son. I was at a Republican meeting, if you can believe that, where I first heard of the tragedy of American compassion. And actually, Newt Gingrich introduced me to that book. We were on Mackinac Island. I remember it very well. He mentioned it several times in his speech. I went home and bought that book. And I would just say to every one of you here, every pastor here, every leader here, every American here, get that book and read it. This nation could be transformed if we follow what's in that book. So I stole everything I could out of Dr. Olasky's books. People are always complimenting me about Grace Centers of Hope. Well, that's not true. I shouldn't tell that. I started to say I never tell them about where I got it, but I do. I've given away over probably 100 of the Tragedy of American Compassion books. It is a tremendous book. And I don't say this just to flatter him, but he is truly one of my heroes and has been, and he hasn't known it all of these years. But I am so delighted to get to meet him. I could tell you so much about him, but you have already read that. He actually got his PhD from, there's another university besides Michigan State here in Michigan. I have a grandson playing football for Michigan State, so I'm a little partial that way. Our community here, I know, is honored to have you here, Dr. Olasky. I suppose I should tell this. You know, I am a social Calvinist. Don't hold that against me. How come it got so quiet when I said that in here? That's not a bad term. But at any rate, I believe in Almighty God. In fact, we often say at Grace Centers, we believe in the big G, but it's not big government passing out welfare checks. A big God. And I think how God in His providence, as soon as I got the invitation to come, I told Pam, we're going to that. We're going to have an opportunity. We even got our picture taken tonight with Dr. Olasky. So, Doctor, we're so glad to have you here. I owe you, I'm indebted to you and to our God who brought that book into my life and has transformed, I believe, to a great degree, the city of Pontiac. And we've seen hundreds come to know Christ. We do not receive any government funding whatsoever. Live by faith, as does this organization. And I'm believing, like James, that we could have a real awakening. This is a great opportunity for America. And, I might mention, I have got World Magazine for years and years and years because he's the editor, right? So I've been following him. And they give away this Hope Award. And I said to myself, one of these days, he's going to reward his own seed, as James said before. And this year, we won World Magazine's Hope Award and get to go to Washington in November. And I'm delighted. Dr. Olasky, we're glad to have you.
Well, this is so strange. Ken says I'm a hero of his. Well, he and all the other people who are at the front lines are the heroes of mine. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the Library of Congress researching the history of Christian poverty fighting in America, and then wrote a book and edited a magazine. But I'm not there every day when all these folks in desperate need come into Grace Centers for Hope and lots of others around the country. Ken's there. These are my heroes. And so it's so strange to be thought of as a hero for that. And it's also strange, this is just really strange, that in the 10th year of our Hope Award for Effective Compassion, we've never had a first place winner from Michigan before. And Kent's Center is the one this year. I just met Kent this evening. I had no idea that he had read many years ago this book that I wrote. We get nominations from our readers as for groups that are Christian poverty fighting groups in their community that are practicing compassion that's challenging and personal and spiritual. So Kent's group was nominated. I have some reporters who do some research, first internet research, and then they go visit ones that are very interesting. And our reporter, a very trusted reporter, came back and really had great things to say about Kent's Center. And then it became our Midwest winner. We kind of have a Final Four. We have regional winners, Midwest, East, South, and West. And then our members can vote. We have about 8,000 people who vote on this, and Kent's group got out the vote and won first place for the whole country. And I had no idea at all, and this is why it's so strange and also so gratifying, that maybe I played a little bit role in helping to change a flop house that offered 3 hots and a cot into a group that offers challenging personal and spiritual help that doesn't merely enable people to stay in poverty, but actually challenges them and pushes them and successfully moves them out of poverty through God's grace. So thank you, Ken, for what you do. And thank you, James, for having me here. I think I'm going to pound on James a little bit since Kent did. As far as the major accomplishment of my life is that I've been married for 39 years. And Kent claimed that he had been married for 34, and it seems now that it's actually 36. And all I can say to Kent is, these next 3 years are going to be so great, they'll seem like 5 to you. And so, anyway. But Ken says we believe in the big G, not government. And all of you are here because you support helping students to learn about the big G, in God we trust. And you're here because you realize the danger of putting our trust in any other G like government. And the people from government who are here, the state senators sitting next to me, I suspect they know this best of all. So no insult to them. They're seeing it first for up close, and they're heroes of mine for going and trying to turn government around. And the Student Statesmanship Institute, I'm impressed. Boy, I wish I had gone to something like this when I was in high school. I didn't, and I will tell you the sad story. I became an atheist as a teenager. This is during the Vietnam War era when I was in college, and I went to Yale University and was involved in anti-war protests and lots of other stuff. I can't blame the professors for making me a Marxist because I was already heading in that direction, but they certainly contributed to that. And I just kept going further and further all the way so that by the time I arrived at the University of Michigan in 1973, I was actually a card-carrying member of the Communist Party USA. Now you may say, well, how did that differentiate you from other people at the University of Michigan? But no, I'm not far be it from me to make any suggestion along those lines. But there were certainly a lot of Marxist professors there. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to go to the U of M, because I had heard of its reputation as a real fountain of radicalism. And the strangest thing happened. I started going there in September of 1973. As a proud, card-carrying communist, I had been one for a while. November 1st, 1973, I sat down in my chair on a room a few blocks from the U of M campus. And something happened to me that had never happened before, hasn't happened since, and I wasn't doing any drugs, which again, I suspect you're saying, well, wait, you're at the U of M campus. Why? Anyway, won't go there. But I sat down and I was in my chair for 8 hours, from 3 o'clock until 11 o'clock, just looking over at the clock next to my bed every hour and just wondering. I was just sitting there, and all these thoughts were coming into my brain, pounding my brain. What if I'm wrong? What if Lenin is wrong? I was just reading a pamphlet by Lenin that I read before called Socialism and Religion, in which Lenin claims that the basis of Marxism, the basis of communism, is atheism. That was certainly the case for me. But for some reason, all these thoughts came into my brain. What if Lenin's wrong? What if there really is a God? And that went on for 8 hours, just sort of sitting there being bombarded. I was a very slow learner, and then I just got up and really walked around the campus. It was November 1st, and it was getting kind of cold, but I just walked around for a couple of hours, really mourning and almost weeping, thinking, what have I done? Why am I doing this? And what if I'm really wrong? And I'd like to say that immediately that was a transformative experience for me, and that I immediately grasped onto Christianity, but no, not at all. It did kick me out of communism. I quickly resigned from the Communist Party. I realized that was just built on sand. But I come from a Jewish background. I was bar mitzvahed at 13, atheist at 14, which is somewhat traditional now in American culture. And I certainly wasn't going to have anything to do with this Christian stuff or anything like that. And here's the strange way that God worked. At the University of Michigan, I was, in order to get a PhD, you have to have a good reading knowledge of a foreign language, and I had forgotten my childhood Hebrew, I had forgotten my high school French, and I had been studying Russian. I had taken the Trans-Siberian Railroad across the Soviet Union, I had gone across the Pacific on a Soviet freighter, I had learned some Russian in the process, and so I was continuing to study Russian at that point, even after leaving the Communist Party, because I was far enough along in that I figured I could do that, satisfy the language requirement, and not have to mess with French or anything like that anymore. Well, one night in my room, I was looking around for stuff to read in Russian, just for reading practice. And I had read some Tolstoy, I had read some Dostoevsky. I was able to do that very slowly. I looked in my bookcase, just reading something in Russian. I wanted to read something I hadn't read before. And there was a copy of the New Testament in Russian that I had been given a couple of years before when I was a newspaper reporter in Oregon. I won't go through the whole story of why there was a Russian-speaking commune in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, but there was. And they'd given me this copy of the New Testament in Russian that I just held on to as kind of a souvenir, never looked in it, but I thought this was kind of strange. And so I picked it up and started reading it. And I'm probably the only person ever who really loves, the chapter early in Matthew where there's just begat, 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 because I could go through that chapter pretty quickly. I can see the thing. But other chapters were slower. Chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, as I get to the Sermon on the Mount, I had to read very slowly. My knowledge of Russian wasn't very good. And I can see now in retrospect the Holy Spirit was really working on me, and it just made such sense to me I thought, wow, this is true. This isn't, I've read some good authors. I've read some Tolstoy. I've read some Dostoevsky. But this is not from man. This is from God. There's something special here. So that changed me. And I started seriously thinking about stuff. But I was in Ann Arbor. There were a lot of other things that were interesting, and that had an impact on me for a couple of weeks as I was thinking about it. And then I said, well, okay, I'll just move on from that. And God, very thankfully, did not leave me alone there. I was assigned the next year to teach a course in early American literature. And this was a graduate student. I was assigned to teach that course because none of the professors wanted to teach it. They all wanted to do really trendy stuff, like Polynesian Marxist literature and so forth. No one wanted to teach a course in early American literature, so I was the one who had to do it. And I'd never taken a course like that, something I'm supposed to teach it. So I had to do a crash course in reading. Well, what's early American literature? It's lots of Puritan sermons. So here I am, not of my own desire, not of my own will, but just this happened in God's providence. I am having to read John Cotton and Cotton Mather and Increase Mather and especially Jonathan Edwards. And I had grown up believing that Christians were kind of stupid people who worship Christmas trees. And, I had all these prejudices, but reading the New Testament had knocked out some of those prejudices. And then reading these Puritan sermons. You can like the Puritans, you can dislike them, you can be a Calvinist, you can be an anti-Calvinist, but you can't say these guys were stupid. They really worked things out, and really worked things out very logically and very thoughtfully, and I think very prayerfully. So there again, all these things I was running from, God kept putting these things in my path. Until finally, I could go on with this, but I'll try to make this short. 1976, I was offered a teaching job at the University at San Diego State University, and so went there with my new wife, who had come from a very liberal Michigan United Methodist background, somewhat like Hillary Clinton's background in that way, and far enough away from Christ so that her parents could later blame me for corrupting her, and my parents could blame her for corrupting me. But both coming from these very different points, we both felt a need at this point for Jesus. And I would like to tell you, I approached a church to go to in a very thoughtful way, but no, these were the days, you may have to explain this to some of your children, there were these things called yellow pages, big yellow page books. And you found out, and so I went on the yellow pages, I looked under churches. And, I knew that Baptists, I had read in the New Testament that Christians baptized people. So I said, okay, well, there are all these listings for Baptist churches. Okay, I'm looking at Baptist churches. And then I looked, further the divisions of different types of Baptist churches, and there was a conservative Baptist church. And I thought, yeah, I'm not a communist anymore, I'm a conservative, so I'll go to a conservative Baptist church, which was located just several blocks away from our house in God's providence. And so we went there, and this was a church, it was a small church. We were in our 20s. I was 20, just turned 26. My wife was 22. And I don't think anyone else in the church was under 60. And it was one of these churches where the minister, a very nice pastor, John Berger, had the same sermon every week, as we learned. Basically, you must be born again. And that was exactly the sermon that we needed to hear. And, those of you with Baptist backgrounds, you'll understand this, that there was you walked the sawdust trail to the front, and there would be a hymn at the end, and it was always, just as I am, without one plea. Week after week, the same thing played very slowly. And since we were the only new people in the church, perhaps for years and years, for weeks, a couple of months, everyone would be turning around and looking at us. So, and then finally, not feeling any crowd pressure, but we figured, yeah, this is true. And much as I knew this was going to be toxic for my academic career, much as we did not want to be identified with these fundamentalist folks, this is true. What can we do? And so there was a minister of visitation, a very elderly gentleman named Earl Atnip. He hadn't finished high school. He came over to our apartment, and we were just sitting in the California sun late in the fall. And he didn't do any intellectual razzmatazz with me or anything like that. He just said to me, well, you believe this stuff, don't you? And I said, in just about the strongest profession of faith you could ever imagine, well, I guess I do. And he said, well, then you should sign up. which meant actually getting baptized and joining, and we did the following Sunday. So that's how we became Christians. And 39 years later, having learned a few things along the way, that's who we are, through God's grace. So it's all unmerited mercy. And if you want to read any more about this, I brought a few little books along that explain this. I mean, just my past there, which are available afterwards. But it's all God, really, and strange, a strange story. But let me tell you about what I learned, because I want to really get to SSI and not any more of my own stuff. I would like to say that I had a good understanding of the proper role of law and government, but I don't think I did. The relationship was very confusing to me. There were times I thought that, oh, gee, if we only have good laws, then everything will be fine. And not until I actually started reading and studying more in the Old Testament and then the New Testament did I realize that actually the good laws can take you a certain way, and it's good to have good laws. It's good to have state senators and representatives who will fight for good laws, but that doesn't do it. We used to have what was called a model cities program in this country. Well, Israel was a model country, in a way, but it went down the drain. And that's because we're all sinners, and we desperately need not only law, but grace. I mean, I know this particularly coming from a Jewish background, with the law so strong, that doesn't cut it. You need grace. You need Christ's grace. We need to realize that we're bigger sinners than we thought, but God also loves us more than we ever thought possible. We need to work for good laws, but the key thing here is God changing our hearts. And we've certainly seen that in recent decades. We had good laws against abortion, but those didn't do it, and then, of course, judges started legislating from the bench, and there we are. Same things happened with marriage. We had good laws at one point, honoring marriage, and now you see what happened. Same things happening with drug laws in Colorado and all over, and probably in Ann Arbor. Despite whatever the state government says, Ann Arbor's a law to itself. So it is wonderful here that students can go to SSI and learn to, just reading from their quotation, can give themselves as servant leaders in a bankrupt culture. That's who we are. Now, what do we do in this bankrupt culture? I think we can all recognize it is bankrupt in lots of ways. It's a friend of mine named Rod Dreher, who's a very smart guy who lives in St. Francisville, Louisiana, and he has this plan called the Benedict Option. He basically thinks, it's not quite a separatist thing, but he basically thinks it's pretty much all over for American culture generally. And we have to form little communities, as Benedict did, forming monasteries about 1,500 years ago. And we have to retreat to those monasteries, and not that we all have to become monks, but we have to have these communities and try to get something going there because the whole culture is going down the drain. And yeah, I mean, I like Rod. He's a smart guy. Went to visit him recently. He gave me, I never had a mint julep before in my life, but he introduced it to me. So, my old conservative Baptist friends wouldn't like it, but this is all part of American culture. There's a problem, I think, in the Benedict Option, in retreating to the Benedict Option. And that's not biblical, I don't think. So much as I can see the reason for that, I can see the frustration, the desperation in some ways, I would like to propose, instead of a Benedict option, a Daniel option. And I think it's more biblical. And let me just take you really briefly through the first 6 chapters of Daniel. I mean, a lot of you I know are familiar with it, some people are a little bit familiar with it, but let me just try to say how I explain this in terms of where we are right now in our bankrupt culture. Chapter 1. And by the way, I'd suggest, things you can do to help your sons and daughters of SSI, of course, subscribe to World and all that. We'll pass out free issues at the end. But more than that, do a Bible study, maybe with your kids, or those first 6 chapters of Daniel. And here's the way I'd go about it. In chapter 1, just to set the scene here, this is about 2,600 years ago. Daniel and a lot of other teenagers have been forcibly enrolled, taken from their homeland, moved to Babylon as prisoners, as captives, and enrolled in a 3-year, I guess you could call it an MBA program, Master of Babylonian Arts program, which is going to teach them about Babylonian culture and hopefully get them into it. They're given new names, Babylonian names related to the Babylonian gods. But they're there, and they're captives, and they're being introduced to this. And here, chapter 1 is about Daniel trying to stake out an independent position for himself. Those of you who read it, you'll recall that he says, he talks with the person in charge of feeding them, we don't want to eat all this fine food from the king's table. Because much like some college dormitories these days, if you've been in a college cafeteria, they're a lot different than they used to be. Very good food that's offered. And so this was the very nice dorm food at a very monarchical, kingly level. Daniel says, we don't want that. We just want to eat vegetables. And some people have said, well, explain different reasons. Maybe he was really an early vegetarian. Or it may have been, food sacrificed to God and so forth. But there are a whole lot of reasons why those interpretations, I think, are less sufficient than what seems to me, as I've studied this and read various theologians discussing this, is a better reason. Really, he did not want to get used to a very high standard of living like that. He wanted to have independence. And one of the things I taught all my students for years at the University of Texas was, if you get a well-paying job, don't live up to your income. Save a lot of it. I mean, Jay, if you could live on half that income, if it's a good-paying job, do that. Put it away, because that'll actually give you some independence. That'll give you some opportunity if you're told to do things that aren't biblical. That'll give you some opportunity to say, well, no, I'm not going to do it, and go elsewhere as opposed to being captive. You don't want those golden handcuffs, as people sometimes in business call them. And that is what I think is going on in chapter 1. And it's a very useful discussion to have with your kids about the importance of trying to save some money in order to have some financial independence. Certainly don't go into debt, but save some money, and that gives you the opportunity, that gives you liberty at times not to be forced to do certain things which are unbiblical. And I think that's what chapter 1's about, and you can have a very interesting discussion with your kids about that. And chapter 1 has a happy ending. I mean, Daniel and his 3 friends eat this different diet, and they're very healthy. And not only that, they ace their oral exams, and the king is very impressed with them, and they're in great shape. So that's the end of chapter 1. They've become part of the wise men of Babylon. They passed their courses, they graduated. Good ending, happy ending. Well, of course, chapter 2, you realize, well, no, now that they're part of the think tank of Babylon, that's actually big trouble, because the king can get very mad at them. And so King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and this is the dream where he's a head of gold, and then there's silver, there's bronze, and then eventually you come down and the feet are not very strong. In fact, some of the feet are a mixture of clay and other stuff. So it's obviously not a very stable statue. King Nebuchadnezzar has the dream. None of the wise men, he tells the wise men, you have to tell me what the dream was and then interpret it. They all say, that's crazy. How can we tell you what it was? Well, he wants to see if they're just court flatterers or if they actually know what they're doing. And when they can't do it, he says, kill them all, which is going to include Daniel and his 3 friends. Daniel keeps his cool. Because he's been so diligent in his academic work, he can say, oh, give me some time on this, and I'll go to the king and I'll be able to interpret what the dream is. He has faith that God will deliver that to him, and God does. And so he goes before the king and explains it. And the king's very happy with that, because he's the head of gold. He doesn't care what's going to happen after he's dead and down the road and things like that. So Daniel here is showing in chapter 2, I mean, he has courage. But in a way, he's almost, and I'm not saying he was lying and all that, he wasn't. He was very honest in all this, but he's telling the king still what the king wants to hear. So sometimes we do a character study of Daniel, and we say, well, Daniel had this great character all the time, every step of the way. Well, no, I don't think so. At least this is the interpretation I'd throw forward and perhaps discuss with your kids. Because in chapter 3, there's a huge mystery. I don't know if you've ever played with your kids or you had the books, Where's Waldo? Well, chapter 3, the big question is, where's Daniel? Because as you recall, King Nebuchadnezzar, oddly enough, he's had this dream of the statue, and then suddenly he sets up this huge 90-foot tall statue, all of gold, and he says to everyone, all the leaders, all the members of the think tank, you have to bow down to the statue. And then Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down. I mean, they were able to make a current thing here, because I think there are some resemblances of our bankrupt culture in Babylon. In Babylon, there were all these different nationalities, all these different ethnic groups, all these different local gods. There may be 100 different ethnic groups all mixed in there. And King Nebuchadnezzar was still offering them freedom of worship. They could still worship their own gods. as long as they also bow down to this idol that Nebuchadnezzar had created. So they had freedom of worship. What they didn't have was freedom of religion. They had freedom of worship. They could go and worship, but they didn't have freedom of religion all through the day, 24/7, all through the week. And by the way, if you've looked at the rhetoric coming out of Washington, there was something that, a few of us saw a few years ago, and we're just wondering how significant is this. People started talking, including Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and President Obama and others. They started talking about freedom of worship rather than freedom of religion. And people thought, well, it's just a matter of words, language, and things like that. Well, no. Huge difference. Freedom of worship means, right now in America, yeah, you can go to church and you can worship for an hour a day, but you don't have, an hour a week. You don't have that freedom of religion the other 167 hours of the week. You have worship, but you can't carry it all through the day, and you can't do things like Kent does at Grace Centers for Hope. So the pressure is going to be enormous. But here in Babylon, they were still able to worship their own gods, but they all had to bow down. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say no. And you know the story, I suspect. They are thrown into a fiery furnace. And they obviously should all be burned up. Even the people who were at the door throwing them in were burned up. And it doesn't happen. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar and others look in and they see not just three figures there, but they see a fourth, which may very well have been. A lot of theologians talk about that as theophany, essentially. The appearance of Christ himself, walking with them and protecting them and saving them from the fire. So it's a great story of God protecting them. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, by the way, they don't know that God's going to protect them. And they tell Nebuchadnezzar, we're not going to bow down. And we don't know. Maybe God will preserve us, maybe he won't, but we're still not going to do it. So it's a great story of their bravery, God's faithfulness, but where was Daniel? And there were some theologians in the Reformation who speculated about that also, and of course we don't know. But their surmise was that, well, Daniel was somewhere else. Maybe Daniel wasn't coming forward at that point. Maybe he didn't want to be burned up also. We don't know. But it seems to me highly possible, and at least according to these very revered reverends from 500 years ago, maybe even probable that Daniel was just not there. He was AWOL at that time. Now you can say, gee, that's kind of depressing, because here Daniel, this man of great character, wasn't there. He in some way dodged being in the fire. Well, yeah, depressing in some ways, I suppose, if we just want to have him as a character study apart from God. But I think of myself, and I know that apart from God, I was worshiping idols. And I needed to be born again, much as I heard week after week and much as the Bible talks about. And all of us, I think, are the same. Sometimes we hold up these biblical characters as, character studies as if, gee, this is their character. Well, it's not their character until God changes their character. And that may have been exactly what's happening with Daniel, that maybe somewhere in that thing in chapter 3, he's born again. Because the Daniel that comes out of that is very different in some ways from the earlier Daniel. Daniel in chapter 4 also has to interpret a dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel then gives a very different interpretation. It's a different dream, a different interpretation, but it's also an interpretation that's not going to make Nebuchadnezzar very happy. Daniel hears the dream from Nebuchadnezzar. He interprets it and says, Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to go crazy. God is going to punish you for your arrogance. You're going to go crazy, and you're going to be like an animal for 7 years. And that takes a lot of guts. If any of you have ever counseled kings or presidents or governors, it takes a lot of guts to tell someone like that. Nebuchadnezzar could have been furious and thrown him into the fiery furnace again. Apparently Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do it at this point. He has maybe some trust in Daniel or whatever, but he doesn't do it. But indeed, what Daniel prophesies based on that dream comes true. Nebuchadnezzar does go crazy. He is totally berserk for 7 years and out in the field eating grass and this is going on. And at the end of chapter 4, then Nebuchadnezzar comes back to his senses. God delivers him from that, and Nebuchadnezzar is praising God. So this is astounding. But I'm particularly impressed with the change in Daniel, that he's now doing that, and that continues in chapter 5. You may think, well, that's a happy ending. Nebuchadnezzar is praising God. Maybe he's going to have laws, and God he will be acknowledged as God. Well, that doesn't happen. He's still apparently, in the eyes of the government, one God among many, many other gods. And in chapter 5, many years have gone by. Daniel's out of power. He may even be an old man at this point. There's a different king, Belshazzar, who has no memory whatsoever of Daniel. And Belshazzar sees the handwriting on the wall, the famous scene, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now, he doesn't know what that means. There's the queen mother around who remembers the old days, remembers Daniel, and says, why don't you go ask Daniel? Daniel comes in, and boy, does he give a courageous message in that place. No shilly-shallying whatsoever. He says, this is what it means. You and your kingdom have been weighed in the scales of God. You've been found wanting. Your kingdom is going to end very soon, and the Medes and the Persians will take over. And the king, I mean, he's drunk. They've taken out they've taken the drinking the goblets and other vessels from the temple, and they're acting in very sacrilegious ways. So he may have thought it's a big joke or something. Well, that very night, the walls of Babylon, and this historically is accurate. The opposing forces are able to come in, and Belshazzar and his nobles are slain that very night. So things come through very quickly. Well, we may think then that it's all happily ever after. Then Daniel will live that. But chapter 6 of Daniel, again, and if you do this with your kids, and you can say, well, there are all these things that indicate, gee, the battle's won, and now Daniel can just rest on his laurels. Battle's never won, and every chapter brings a new situation which confronts Daniel, and he has to react in a godly way or an ungodly way. And here in chapter 6, you have the most famous episode of all of the book of Daniel, namely Daniel in the lion's den. And the new king, a Persian king, is hornswoggled, basically tricked by his advisors into issuing an edict far different than any of these previous edicts. This is an edict that says you don't have freedom of religion, you also don't have freedom of worship anymore. You cannot worship your own God. For 30 days, you can't worship your own God, you only have to worship me, essentially, the government, the central power. You can't do any of this stuff. Well, what does Daniel do at this point? Again, Daniel is the born-again Daniel, the courageous Daniel. And again, I don't see this as depressing in some way to think that maybe Daniel's character grew. He wasn't always great, because you look all through the Bible, I mean, you look at Peter, and you see how Peter was turned through God's grace from a skulking coward into a great hero of faith. Peter, instead of, as Jesus is about to be killed, Peter is, instead of being of any help or something, he's just warming himself by the enemy's fire. And of course, the famous thing where before the cock crows 3 times, Jesus had predicted that, and that's, of course, exactly what came true, and Peter realizes it, and he is so ashamed. And then, of course, everything changes as he sees the resurrection, as he sees the new infusion of God's grace in him, and he becomes ferociously heroic. And you see this so many times with so many other people, that this is, and if God can do it with those people, then God can do it with me. As he, I don't know if I'm not heroic. Kent is the hero, but I have some guts now, and it's all from God. I mean, God changed me from being a hater, a communist, into a Christian. And if God does it to Peter and Daniel and a lot of you here in this room, he can do it to lots and lots and lots of people. And that's actually a sign of hope, not a sign of despair. So in chapter 6, Daniel, with his new God-infused, God-graced character, goes and does what he does every day. He's facing Jerusalem, and he's praying to God with the windows open, the blinds open. He could have closed the blinds, and the spies they didn't have his house bugged or anything like that in those days. They didn't have hidden cameras. But he leaves the windows wide open where he can be seen doing it. And, since Kent has outed me as a Calvinist, and Kent has admitted the same, I will quote from John Calvin's discussion of this whole thing, and saying, well, why didn't, he said, Calvin, this is 500 years ago, Calvin saying, lots of people said Daniel should have just closed the blinds, closed the windows, and been able to pray, but not obviously put himself in harm in that way. And Calvin said, well, no, Daniel had become a leader at that point. And if the leader goes into hiding, then the followers are also. So this is Calvin's interpretation of it, which makes a lot of sense to me, that Daniel very forthrightly, and not secretly, but very forthrightly, comes and says, and makes it evident that he's going to keep doing that. The lion's den, of course, you know the story. He goes in the lion's den, he comes out unscathed. It wasn't the lions were fed because, his enemies were thrown in there and they are eaten up right away. So I can imagine kids through the centuries saying, oh, goody, goody, the bad guys get it. Well, they did. And this is also part of the way God works. How does this apply to today? I think you do this study with your kids. You see the way that God changes people. You see the way that God's grace is huge. You see the way that it's really not laws are good, but it really comes down to God's grace. And, centers of grace and hope. That's the winner in Pontiac, that's the winner in our own lives, and that's what I think the kids at SSI learn, because as I understand it, it's not government camp. It's a camp where they learn about government, but they learn deeper things too. They learn about grace. They learn about the importance of law, but the absolute centrality of grace. And that's invaluable. What's it worth to learn that? Some of us have to go through horrible experiences, difficult experiences to learn that. But if you don't have to be thrown into a fiery furnace, then you don't want to be. If you can learn it through God's kindness and teaching you in some other way, if you can learn it by going to SSI and hearing instructors and bonding with other kids with Christian backgrounds and seeing that, then how much better are you off? You don't want any of your kids to have to go through really hard, miserable times in order to learn about Christ and really understand this personally, not just because you've taught it and you've had a life, but because they understand it. I'm just going to close with another person who runs an anti-poverty group in Houston. And this is a guy who was deep into drugs, all sorts of other bad stuff, and he would still occasionally call his mom. And his mom would ask him, well, how are you doing? And he would say, honestly, he said, I'm doing miserably. I'm addicted, I'm living this really terrible life, but that's where I am and I really see no way out of it. And his mom would say, well, good. I hope it gets worse for you. Because only when it gets worse are you going to see that your only hope is in Christ. And that's just something as parents I think we all want. We want the good end product. We hope our kids don't have to go through misery to learn it. If they have to, well, so be it. And we can thank God for that. But if they can instead learn some of the stuff at SSI and take it to heart, and God can preserve them from those terrible experiences, how much better that is, how much nicer it is, how much nicer it is for them and you. And God can do that. I mean, I know lots of people, God's done it without leading them to horrible experiences. I also know lots of people who have had to go through that horror. And we don't want that to happen to our kids. So what's it worth? What's SSI worth? To help our kids get on the right path, to learn about God's law, but also God's grace. It's priceless. Thank you for listening to me. And I pray for SSI and for all of you. Thank you very much.